Hi guys, I'm Duncan Epping. I'm a principal architect working for VMware as well. I'm part of the technical marketing team, and my focus over the last 6 months primarily has been storage and ESXi. And I've written the vSphere clustering book together with Frank.
Hi, my name is Frank Denneman. I'm a consulting architect at VMware PSO.
All right, so just a little background information on all three of us. So all three of our blogs are up there. I'm sure you guys know Yellow Bricks and Duncan's as well. So did you guys come with questions? I hope. Somebody better raise their hand or it's going to be a really short session. Definitely, yes? All right, so what I'll start it off. I actually have a question for these guys because I wanted to kind of kick things off, but you guys are going to have to definitely wake up and ask a few. But we all saw the release last week, I believe. vSphere 5 was GA, right? Cool news. There's a couple other announcements, I think, this morning that got broken out. So what I wanted to ask you guys is...
Let's start off with a question. Is anyone already running vSphere 5 at this moment?
That's a good question.
In production?
In production. Yeah, all the hands.
It's only the Dutch guys. What's up with that?
Yeah, they all went up and then...
And all went down again.
Okay. All right. So what I wanted to ask you guys, because we do have some slides, and we're going to be jumping around in some of these. So there's some slides for reference. So I apologize. I'll have to back out of the slides and jump to what we want. But with all of the new enhancements that were announced with vSphere 5, I wanted to know from you guys, each of you personally, what are some of your favorite new enhancements and why?
Well, it's easy. It's storage DRS. That's the awesome one. The initial placement one and the IO load balancing. It's phenomenal. It's great. So please ask questions about storage DRS. So
I guess the only answer I can give is HA, of course. That's basically my baby. The cool things around HA, the things that changed, in my opinion, are the data store heart beating. So everything around resiliency that has changed. The master-slave concept. So everyone who's familiar with 4.1 knows the primary, secondary concept, and the fact that you can only have 5 primary nodes running in a cluster. But that all changed with vSphere 5, and that's one of the reasons I love HA and vSphere 5.
So you'll be able to figure out which sections of the book each one of them wrote, probably.
Well, that's actually not completely true. So if you look at the book, I primarily wrote the HA section. Frank did the complete DRS section, and we did the storage DRS section together. So,
excellent. So we do have a first question. Great. Break the ice for us, please. Can we get the mics turned up? All right, go ahead.
No phasers. In a large-scale HA environment, and given that I could run 10 gig bandwidth down to the server, what is the actual usable amount of bandwidth that can actually be consumed? So can you actually exploit 10 gig connectivity? And if I have 10 gig connectivity and want to use large-scale HA, roughly how much should I be putting into, how much bandwidth should I be given to HA?
So you're talking purely about networking bandwidth for virtual machine consumption, or are you talking about storage bandwidth?
Network bandwidth.
Sorry?
Network bandwidth.
Network bandwidth. So, well, to begin with, basically every single environment that I've seen over the last 10 years, I've never seen anyone even, hitting 1 gig, so let alone 10 gigs. That's not going to happen, especially with the amount of virtual machines you can run on a single host. Basically every single environment that we see today, roughly 30, 35 virtual machines. If you want to flood a 10 gig link, which can run 8 gigabit, I think, from the top of my head, that's vastly impossible. It's even the amount of clock cycles that you would need to flood that link, you're not going to hit that. I've never seen that. So you could even easily run 300 virtual machines and not even hit that limit.
But there's still a use case for 10 gigs. So for vMotion, for example, the more bandwidth you have, the faster your VM will be transferred to the other host, and DRS itself will take into account the speed of the vMotion itself. So by having a lot of bandwidth, you get more transitions or more migrations for one DRS invocation period to actually move around. So the more bandwidth you have, the much faster your DRS cluster will be balanced. So that's an excellent use case.
Excellent. So again, being a Q&A, who else has some questions? I know there was some over here on this side earlier, but we definitely want to keep this rolling. It's a little interesting to be a Q&A. Question here, if you.
All right, my question is this. We have an established VMware environment. Like a lot of people in this room, we built it from scratch without knowing what we were doing. So now we need to go back in and fix the things that are bad. And what would be best practices? I've got 57 hosts that are on Fabric. What would be the best approach for getting clustering going? Because right now we're really not using any of the SAN storage really, and a lot of things are on local storage.
Local storage.
Can you repeat the question?
So can you just repeat that quickly? I don't think they heard it from the microphone, but he's got 57 hosts. He's looking for best practices. Now, you're local storage, you said, right?
We're doing a lot of local storage, and we just now started migrating to the SAN Fabric.
The SAN storage? Mm-hmm. So is there a specific area that you're looking for best practice?
Pretty much, how do I get a clustering built to use the SAN device?
All right, building, best practice on cluster building to use SAN storage and migration of off of local.
There are a couple of things, I guess. It kind of depends on which version you'll be using. If it's 4.1, there's a couple of constraints around that. If it's 5.0, you don't have those constraints, and I will get that into a second. It will depend on the type of environment that is. Is it a blade environment? Is it regular DL 380 type of environment? So
these are all Dell 910s and 900s.
Now let me explain why I'm mentioning that. So like I said in the beginning when we started out with the introduction, there's a concept which is called primary and secondary node, it's HA, and they used to exist before 5.0. And we've got there's a slide about that, I think.
Yep.
Anyway, when you've got a blade chassis and you would have all your primary nodes in a single blade chassis, and something happens to that blade chassis, HA wouldn't fail over any virtual machines anymore, because the primary node is basically responsible for failing over virtual machines. So depending on the type, that's the new one. I'll explain that in a second. But depending on the type of environment that you have, you're using blades. If you're using normal, regular servers, there's a specific way to set up the environment. So if it's not a blade chassis, then you could basically go up to 32 nodes in the cluster. That's not a problem at all. The only issue that you might have is the amount of virtual machines that you are running and the amount of LUNs that you would have in a single environment, because an ESX host can only have 256 LUNs. And I don't know if you guys are running 256 LUNs, but if you do a rescan of your storage environment, that's going to take ages with 256 LUNs, and that's something that we normally wouldn't recommend. So depending on the amount of virtual machines you want to run on the host itself, and depending on the amount of virtual machines in that cluster, you might want to carve it up into multiple clusters. I guess the thing is, though, for HA it doesn't really matter how large the cluster is. If it's 32 nodes, if it's 24 nodes, that will work fine. The thing is with DRS, and Frank's probably going to explain that, is that the balancing in the 32 node cluster is probably a lot easier because you got more options. Can you explain the balancing part?
Sorry, you stole my thunder with that one. So,
sorry, Frank.
So one thing you need to be aware of that DRS is using a compatibility list. So that means that each host needs to be compatible with the virtual machine hardware configuration. So, for example, the port groups and the place where it's stored on. So if you have a 32 host cluster, you need to make sure that all the port groups or all the hosts have the same port groups and have the same data store connected as well. Because if you have what's called a partially connected cluster, so that means that not all the hosts have the same LUN attached, the DRS algorithm is being, limited, basically. So the best thing to do is having an identical configuration on all the hosts for the best DRS performance. And what Duncan said, the more options you have, the more places it can go, actually. So.
And I guess when you start configuring in the environment, one thing to keep in mind is, like Frank said, it's all about consistency. So make sure all data stores are actually connected to all hosts. Make sure all port groups are available to all hosts, because that's what HA needs as well to do the failover. If the data stores aren't connected to all the hosts, then you might not be able to fail over the virtual machine. So there's additional downtime on top of that. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you're going to do a restructuring of your environment, script the environment. Do a scripted install. Use PowerCLI for configuring it. because that way it's going to be consistent. Even if you make mistake, at least the mistake is consistent across all hosts, and you'll figure it out pretty soon probably. And test it.
So if it's wrong, at least it'll be consistently
Yeah,
wrong.
it's severely wrong.
At least you can find it.
Thanks.
Excellent. We got a couple more questions.
Hi there. Got a question around VMware swap files for each VM. With storage DRS, is there any change to best practices to where those should be held now? Or will they simply, by the nature of balancing the I.O., just leave it with the VM and let storage DRS take care of it?
So just to clarify, are you talking about this will go to Frank for storage DRS. You're talking about VM swap file as part of the ESX, right?
Right. You can store with host or store with VM, or put them in a different data store altogether.
Yeah, so basically when you enable storage DRS, each virtual machine will have an affinity rule for its files, and by default all files, including the swap file, will be stored into one data store. So your swap file will be stored with your VM case. You can, however, change it, and you can span it across multiple data stores if you like.
Will that have an effect on storage DRS in any way, positive or negative?
I don't really see that. No, I don't think so.
You got to think about it for more than 5 seconds.
Tough question to get a hook, Chris.
I think that's the first one, actually.
That might be. Yeah, we might have to go back and check on that.
So it
is that really
depends.
the crux of the question? Is there an impact to storage DRS?
So it really actually depends on your memory usage. So if you have a lot of overcommitment and you hit your swap files a lot, yeah, then it will have an effect, of course. But in the end, it's usually still in the same data store cluster anyways. So it depends on the layout of your data store cluster, the LUNs in your data store cluster, and how it's being offered or provided by your array.
So with the array, if you've got it tiered in a way that your VM's data store, you want lots of I.O. on it, so you've got it on some fast disks, would you want your swaps on some lower cost disks and keep them all dedicated in its own sort of pool of data stores, or just keep them the same?
So from a cost perspective, you might want to have that your way, so like the swap files on cheap slow disks and your VM case on fast disks. But for performance, you might want to have those on fast disks as well, because it's still memory swapping. And so you want to have the fastest available performance for your virtual machine. So it can either go both ways.
So could they sit, generally speaking, on a low IOPS data store, and then if swapping begins, let them migrate to faster tier?
Okay, so good question. So storage DRS does not support auto tiering. So if you, let me rephrase that. So you can enable storage DRS on an array on the LUNs or data stores on auto tiering arrays, but I/O load balancing is not supported.
Hold on, let me rephrase that. It actually is supported. Let me completely clear, because Scott Lowe is sitting in the room, and EMC probably has got a different view on this. So it actually is supported. We say, check out the statement that your storage vendor actually makes around this. And the reason for it being is what storage DRS actually does is it doesn't only look at I/O metrics and space balancing, but it also characterizes the disks. So what it does, it basically injects random I/O onto the disk, it's read I/O, and in an auto-tiering environment, some of the blocks might be hosted on SSDs, other blocks might be hosted on slow storage. The characterization of that, it has an impact on that, because if it reads on SSD only for whatever reason, that particular LUN might appear to be really quick to storage DRS, while it actually isn't in real life. So that's one of the reasons that we say, check out what the storage vendor actually recommends. I know NetApp, EMC, HDS, they probably all recommend to disable the I/O metric for storage DRS when it comes to auto-tiering arrays. But from our perspective, it is supported, but be careful with it.
Okay. Great, thank you very much.
Corrected.
Another thing that I wanted to add around now that I'm talking anyway, around the host swap files. So there's a new feature in vSphere 5, I don't know if you guys heard about it, but it's swap to host cache. And basically what it does is you can use a local SSD drive and swap to that. And that's, in my opinion, a really cool feature, because it's going to lower the latency around memory swapping. So that's going to help. So check it out. If you got local SSD, that's something you definitely want to use.
Great question.
Good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I have a question about storage DRS. Does it have any dependency on VAI implementations by your SAN vendors? And if so, what?
Well, from a storage DRS perspective, we support any environment. So if it's running, if it's supporting VAI or VASA or whatever, that's not really relevant to us. Okay. If you look at it from an operational perspective, so if I would have to pick any array, I would say it needs to be VAI enabled. And the reason for it being is that as soon as the storage vMotion happens, it's going to be offloaded when you're using VAI. And, offloading it to the array, it's going to be 10 times as fast as doing it through the hypervisor. So it's definitely, recommended, in my opinion, to have a VAI enabled array.
But it's not required.
It's not a requirement, not at all. So it's just going to take a bit longer, the storage vMotion itself, because the data is going to flow through the hypervisor. That's the only thing.
In that case, how does the local storage or whatever storage of choice, if it's not VAI implemented, how does storage DRS get those metrics? Or is it performing those metrics on its own? Like the information about what kind of disk, how fast the disk, because those are features that I would think would have to come out of VAI.
So storage DRS uses a couple of different metrics. So basically it uses latency metrics, which are just the regular metrics you can find in ESXstop as well. I don't know if you guys looked at storage I/O control, but storage I/O control basically uses those metrics as well. They expose those metrics to vCenter, and that's what storage DRS uses. The characterization itself, that's something that's part of storage I/O control. That's what I just spoke about. It's called the injector. Mm-hmm. And it injects random I/O. It doesn't actually use any VAI data or any VASA data at all. It's a proprietary algorithm that VMware basically created that characterizes the disk by itself. We don't need any additional data. In the future, though, that's going to change. Now that we've got VASA and there will be next versions coming up, that kind of information will be supported up, brought back up to vCenter itself so that vCenter can actually make recommendations based on the information provided by VASA.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I'm in a smaller shop than probably some of these people are. And
can you speak?
Sorry, I'm in a smaller shop than some other people here. So I've only the biggest cluster I have 10 nodes in there, and I've elected not to use HA because it just adds another layer of things that can go wrong. And we haven't had very many, if any, hosts failed. So my question for you is, in version 5, is there some things that were added to or fixed that would alleviate my hesitance to implement an HA cluster?
Did you hear that?
Yeah, I heard it. So I know, in 4.1 and 4.0 and even versions before that, I know a lot of people had issues with enabling an HA. And the main thing usually was the second bullet point, DNS. 85% of all the problems we had submitted to our GSS department were all related to DNS issues. It usually wasn't an HA problem itself, it was the backend DNS that wasn't working. So now that has been solved. And I actually enabled HA in the 32-node cluster. It took me seconds to enable it. I didn't have any DNS set up. I didn't have a domain. I didn't have anything. It just worked straight out of the box. And I think that's the good thing about v5.0. It's literally going to take you seconds to set it up. It's 8 clicks in total. So it's not going to get any easier than that, in my opinion. I guess the only thing that you need to think about is, for instance, admission control policies. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to enable admission control policies, or are you going to disable it? That's probably the most challenging decision to make. But enabling HA is literally going to take you seconds.
And what about data store heartbeats then?
Yeah. So because that's new as well, right? Data store heartbeating.
Like I said, the data store heartbeating, that's something new. Basically, what HA does with 5.0, it uses the data store as a new communication mechanism. So that actually increased the resiliency for HA. And what it does is, instead of only using the networking, when there's an issue with the network, it actually allows the hosts to communicate with each other using a data store. So, especially, can you guys still hear me? Okay. Okay. So, especially if you're using a fiber channel array, then the data store heartbeating will actually help you increasing the resiliency and help HA make the right decisions for restarting virtual machines.
Okay. For the storage DRS, again, related to VMs that have disks living on different data stores. For instance, in our database environments for DB2 or SQL, our OS disks will be in a completely different tier of storage than the ones that the database disks are themselves. As of right now, each of those database disks gets their own data store like we would set up if it was a physical server. We're just putting on VMFS instead of doing a raw LUN. Is there a benefit to adding this to larger data stores and using storage DRS, or for that type of workload, would you still recommend making sure it's on its own set of disks?
Good question. So, storage DRS exists out of two mechanisms. So it's the initial placement one, and it's the I/O load balancing one. So I/O load balancing is measuring the average latency on the data store. So if the latency exceeds the threshold, virtual machines will move. So from that perspective, if you set a specific latency for those data stores on that data store cluster, you will get the performance you want. So from a design perspective, that means you like to have data stores from the same tier or with the same speed in a data store cluster. So your setup with different types of disks is a challenge for this one.
So basically what Frank is saying is you need to create multiple data store clusters. Yeah. So you're going to create multiple data store clusters based on the availability of a LUN, for instance. So if it's RAID 5, if it's RAID 6, based on that you're going to create multiple data store clusters, and storage DRS will take care of the rest. So storage DRS is perfectly capable of actually managing those virtual machines and balancing those virtual machines across data stores in that data store cluster. But especially when you're using databases, you don't want to have your database actually ending up on RAID 5 storage. You probably want to keep them on RAID 10 storage, so make sure you actually combine the RAID 10 devices into a single data store cluster. And in order to do so, you either need, really good administration, so make sure you got an Excel spreadsheet that lists all the details around your storage, or use VASA. VASA is a new plugin, a new API that basically allows you to expose all the details of your storage array up to vCenter. And basically vCenter will tell you, what type of storage you're running. So if it's RAID 5, if it's RAID 6, if it's replicated, if it's deduplicated, whatever. That's the kind of information that VASA can expose. And it's my recommendation to at least look into it, see if you can use it, and use that to your advantage.
So is it safe to say real briefly that as we know it, so the three of us have been designing vSphere for a while, right? Is it safe to say technologies like storage DRS and a particular question like that we know kind of changes the way we've all been designing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I think there's going to be some new concepts that we'll all have to design around. We've all seen that one. Question from the right.
Yes, I'm looking for a good argument to use HA. We currently use F5 LTMs. So anything that is front-end public-facing, we have 3-node clusters. So is there a good reason to dive into HA since we have the high availability through our F5s?
So what's going to happen if one of those nodes that's sitting behind the F5 fails?
Well, we have 3 active nodes in every cluster, and each node is on a separate host.
So the reason I'm asking, so what normally is going to happen is that someone within the organization needs to stand up, get behind his desk, walk over to the data center, start up their virtual machine or whatever, or start up their physical host. So with HA, HA is going to do that for you, and that's one of the reasons. It's going to automate basically the failover. It's going to take literally 15 seconds before the virtual machine is powered on again. You don't even need to look at it. It's going to throw an alarm for you. It will tell you that the virtual machine has been restarted, and that's it. But not only that, and in most organizations will have virtual machines which aren't using F5 load balancers, because that's only for a very specific type of applications. An application need to support that as well. So in those cases, HA, it won't cost you anything. It's like I just said, it's 8 clicks. You can enable it within a second, and it will basically, get the job done.
Okay, can I take a quick poll? Because we've actually had two people so far that have said they don't use HA. Can I get a show of hands of people that don't actually have HA enabled?
Wow.
Wow.
It's not a lot.
It's not a lot. No. All right. I was getting nervous actually.
So what about DRS then? Everyone using DRS?
Is everyone using DRS?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask another follow-on question, because there's actually, I do want to get to you guys, and there's a particular section here that's of interest to a lot of people. But how many people actually have resource pools configured? Wow, that's more than I thought too.
So how many people have resource pools configured and customized their shares? Keep your hands up.
That's the section that I want to get to.
So how many out of those have got resource pools enabled, customize their shares, and customize their shares based on the amount of virtual machines per resource pool? That's no one. Just a couple. Frank has got some explaining to do, I guess.
We'll get to that, though. I do want to get to that, because that's actually one of my favorite sections. Well, these guys have been standing, so we'll keep going with the questions.
Okay, questions about Microsoft clustering on ESX host. So far, HA and DRS has proven rather useless when used in Microsoft clustering format, because even with a distributed vSwitch, every time there's a DRS or an HA event, the cluster drops, and okay, what's the point there? So we end up having to just disable HA and DRS on all of them. Is there going to be a solution which makes it clean enough that my cluster doesn't freak out every time it drops out and the failed node comes up? The node that HA thinks it's still the owner sets up contention, and the whole thing goes to hell really quickly.
Yeah, well, I've seen many of these issues out in the field, and what most people actually started doing is disabling HA at all and DRS completely for Microsoft clustering services. It's something which is really difficult to solve, and I guess the only thing I can say at this point is that we're actually working on solutions that will allow you to replace Microsoft clustering service completely. Because it's probably one of the most complex things to set up.
I'm sorry. I have 60 developers who will freak out if I even suggest taking
Don't tell them.
clustering.
Don't tell them. Just do it.
So
there's no developers in the room, right? Maybe. All right.
So there's really, even with the SXI5 and the new domain recovery, there's really no solution. There's no plan to let me set
No, there hasn't been any
rule.
enhancements around Microsoft clustering services with 5.0. It's kind of a limitation of Microsoft clustering services in combination with general HA, I guess, and DRS. There's no way to actually solve that at this point in time, unfortunately.
So just a request to take back. It'd be great if we could have the HA rules that let me set up dependencies to not have cluster
That's good
nodes
feedback.
pop up at the same time. It just makes a mess of things. If I could say, it failed, leave down for X number of seconds, then power up, that would be a great plus. Right, thank you.
Thanks for the feedback. I will feed it back to the engineers.
Good morning. We've typically had 2 HA clusters, one production, one test, with about 15 hosts each that can actually all see the same group of data stores. So we have always kind of, as a best practice, stayed under the old limit of 32 hosts connected to the data store, or to the same data store. And I know with vSphere 4 that went up to 64. And we're getting ready to implement another HA cluster, probably with another 20 hosts, which would take us up more like to 50 hosts that can all see the same set of data stores. And I was wondering if that had any negative implications or any implications with storage DRS.
So, are you talking about 64 hosts connected to a data store?
Sorry, say again?
So are you mentioned 64, right?
Yeah, the original limit, if I understand correctly, prior to vSphere 4 was that you can only have a maximum of 32 hosts connected to the same data store for Fibre Channel. And I believe with vSphere 4 that went up to 64 hosts connected to the same data store.
Yeah, but you still can only have 32 hosts inside a cluster.
Inside an HA cluster, right. But in our case, both clusters can see the same set of data stores.
Yeah. So you want to have a storage DRS cluster connected to
not so much, just aside from the storage DRS question, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't running up against any limits on the HA side from having several clusters that could all see the same set of data stores.
So from an HA perspective, there's no real limitation. I guess the limitation comes in from an operational perspective, because now you've got all your data stores connected to all clusters, which means it's really from an operational perspective, it's going to be really difficult to manage that. Where am I going to place those virtual machines? So in my opinion, I always mask data stores based on the cluster, or I mask the data stores on the cluster level, just because it makes managing the environment a lot easier. I don't need to think about virtual machine placement at all. I will just pick one of those data stores. As soon as you start spanning the data stores across multiple clusters, you will need to start thinking about, which group of clusters is using which group of data stores, which is going to slow down the process, and I'm pretty sure at some point you're going to make mistakes. It's not only that, but you need to think about things like SCSI reservations and stuff like that as well. It's going to complicate it, in my opinion. So I would probably suggest to keep it simple and zone it, mask it based on the cluster itself. Because from a storage DRS perspective, there's no real advantage in having huge storage DRS clusters either.
Okay. The other question I had was, we have typically not turned on the VM monitoring feature in HA. Has that changed at all with vSphere 5? Is there any new feature sets there, or is any different?
Yeah, so there's been a couple of enhancements around VM monitoring. I don't know if you guys are familiar with VM monitoring. Is anyone using VM monitoring at this point in time? That's only a few hands. And I guess the main reason for that is that by default, VM monitoring is not enabled, which is something that I always found strange. And in my opinion, it's a very cool solution to check for operating system types of failures. So if there's a blue screen of that, which used to happen all the time, Microsoft.
Nobody's gotten those, right?
It has improved a lot, I would say, and it doesn't happen that often anymore. But if it does happen, then VM monitoring will actually pick up on that and restart your virtual machine based on that. With the old version, VM monitoring used to be part of the vCenter agent. Now it got moved into Fault Domain Manager, which is the new HA agent. It's probably more reliable. On top of that, we added application monitoring as well. And application monitoring was part of 4.1, but the SDK was basically closed down. You couldn't use it. Now we opened up the SDK. You can actually download it, and you can actually write scripts around app monitoring, which will allow your developers to actually use application monitoring and restart virtual machines based on specific alarms. So it's definitely something to look into. I think app monitoring is actually quite cool. William Lamb actually wrote a script, which is, I think it's a Perl script, and it actually monitors a specific executable. If the executable fails or if the service fails and it can't restart it anymore, it basically restarts the virtual machine. It's definitely something to look into. I think it's worth it.
And another great feature of VM monitoring is that if you have a blue screen of that, actually the kernel will get a screenshot and will place it inside the directory, your working directory of your VM, so you can troubleshoot actually what is going on. So you don't lose any tracking whatsoever. So
is the VM monitoring tied at all to VMware tools running on the VM?
Yeah, that's a good question. So VM monitoring actually uses the VMware tools heartbeat to actually check if the virtual machine is still up and running. So what's going to happen if that service fails, for instance? Well, there's two other things it actually looks at. It looks at networking I/O and it looks at storage I/O. So in the case the VMware tools service would fail, there would always be there's always storage on some sort of network I/O, and if it picks up any networking I/O in the last minute, it's not going to reboot your virtual machine, but you definitely need VMware tools installed. But that's the best practice anyway. Always install VMware tools.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. We have Sun Solaris currently in our data centers, and we're planning to move to VMware. Our current installation is Sun Solaris clusters with host-based mirroring. So in case any of the two nodes or the two storages fails, everything is seamless and fail over and fail back. Now we are planning about VMware, but with HA, we can see that only if the host fails, everything goes seamlessly. But in case of the storage, we had either to use vPlex from EMC or go all the way to SRM. Is there any new feature in vSphere 5 to use host-based mirroring?
I'm not sure I fully get the question, to be honest. Are you talking about host-based replication that's part of vSphere, or are you talking about the replication mechanism of your array?
In fact, what do you do in HA if the storage goes down? If you have
storage goes down.
If the storage goes down, you got a big issue. But HA is not going to solve that for you.
That's why I'm asking, because in Sun Solaris cluster,
so
with
the
the
only thing
host-based
you can
mirroring,
do,
either one of the four or two of the fours goes down, we have no problem. That's why EMC, they suggested vPlex.
Yeah.
So I was just asking if there is a software solution other than vPlex.
We don't know.
So currently there are replication solutions out there, software replication solution, but they are not nearly as advanced as vPlex is. vPlex, though, is a fairly complex setup, to say the least. And I don't know if you know Scott Lowe's blog, but he's written many articles around vPlex, and it's not something that we would be able to explain in 5 minutes, to be honest, because it took him weeks to write those articles. But it's if we're talking about storage redundancy, the only thing you can do around that is look into a metro clustering solution. So that's either vPlex, go ahead. NetApp has got solutions around that. EqualLogic, Left Hand. There are a lot of solutions out there, but it needs to be active, and that brings there's a specific cost associated with it. It's fairly expensive as well, to say the least.
So we only got about 20 minutes left, and there's a lot of people online, so I want to keep this rolling a little bit. So left side.
Yes, good morning. What's your opinion about using EVC in a cluster to enable adding new hosts with different processor types?
Sorry,
could you repeat that again?
What's your opinion about using EVC within a cluster to enable adding new processor hosts with new processor types?
EVC.
Always enable EVC.
Always enable?
Always, because it has no performance impact, and that's the major, obstacle most customers have to enable EVC, is that basically EVC will mask or will not broadcast, let's call it that, certain registers of a CPU. It doesn't affect any caching, clock cycle speed, whatever. So if you take a look at the EVC masks, you will see that it will mask like SSE 4.1 or something. So how many applications nowadays running in a virtual infrastructure are using those kind of registers? And if they are, what is the benefit or what is the performance impact of not having that? And that's a very small hit you have. So I asked the developers on that hit, and they really didn't saw any, but we cannot really state that as an official fact, of course. So EVC will give you the opportunity to expand your cluster with new models without making a new cluster at all. So you can expand your cluster in a way that
so enable it.
Yeah,
okay.
Basically enable it. But
that's my other job here, is just keep him from rambling.
Yeah,
what does
I like. It's really hard to explain all, but apparently,
for the sake of time,
the sake of time, enable it. There's no performance impact, so it's only giving you benefits of scaling out your cluster.
It's going to make your life easier in the end.
Right.
Works for me. Thank you.
Hey guys. I have a question about VMFS5 and the 2 terabyte limit that we can go past now without using extent. So where's really the good place to kind of the sweet spot that you guys found in terabyte or size by terabyte on LUNs? So we're looking at 4 terabyte LUNs for 5.0 because I'm tired of managing 1 terabyte and 500 gigabyte LUNs, and I'm hoping that Storage DRS can do that.
How many people still use the old 500 gig LUN rule? Okay, so at least it's not as many as last year.
It's a fairly difficult question, actually, because we get this question probably on a daily basis.
Can I ask the question to the audience? So, what do you feel comfortable in? How many virtual machines running on one disk, on one data store?
I'm fine with around 40 on a decent size, on a good array.
Yeah.
On a wide striped array or something that can handle that kind of I/O.
So how many people are running 40 virtual machines or more on a single data store?
50?
So most of you guys are probably running less than 20, I guess.
How many do 20?
Less than 20? Huh?
So one of the things we always ask is, what's your failure domain? So what is your what's your comfort level on how many virtual machines you can lose if, for example, an administrator will do something to your data store, to your LAN.
Yeah, I mean,
so from a performance perspective, it's not really a case.
So a couple of things as well from a performance perspective. It's really difficult to figure out the amount of IOPS that a single virtual machine is driving, let alone those 40 virtual machines. So what's going to happen? It's going to be really difficult to size an environment based on, the known IOPS from a particular virtual machine, and it's pretty random as well. So what people start doing is they come up. Well, that's what I did. I came up with just a random algorithm, basically, the amount of virtual machines that I'm comfortable with, the average size of those virtual machines, you add the swap files on top of that, 20% extra, and that's what you end up with as a LAN size. In the past, there were issues around SCSI reservations, stuff like that. Well, with 5.0, that has been completely lifted. That's all been, if you got a VAI-enabled capable array, all the SCSI reservations will be offloaded to the array itself, and you won't hear any limitations about that. The main limitations will be, how fast can you actually recover your data when something happens to that LAN, when it's 40 virtual machines running there, and you need to be able to actually restore that in 2 hours. You probably have an issue when it's 4 terabyte, depending on the type of media you're using. So that's something to keep in mind. What does your SLA look like? That's the kind of stuff that you need to keep in mind when you're actually sizing a data store.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Hi. A recent priority of ours has been moving from agent-based backups to array-based snapshot backups. And it's my understanding that storage DRS kind of breaks array-based snapshot backups. So is that something, am I correct in that assumption? And is that something that you're looking at in the future?
So there are a couple of best practices around storage DRS. And it's not really particular around storage DRS. So if you look at some of the capabilities that the arrays have to have today, it's replication, snapshots. But you were talking about snapshots. Then you've got deduplication, thin provision LANs. Every single time a storage vMotion will take place, it will impact one of those technologies. So in the case of a snapshot, when data actually moves, that means you will need to re-snapshot it because some of the data might be outdated, might be lost even. In the case of deduplication, for instance, I had a discussion with some of the vendors. They said, well, we don't want to do storage DRS on those LANs which are deduplicated. And I can imagine why, because as soon as the vMotion takes place, all the data will be undeduplicated. So we will need the deduplication process will need to run again. So there's a cost associated to it. It's definitely something that you need to keep in mind. So for those environments that are running replication, that are running snapshots, you need to set up storage DRS in manual mode so you actually know when the migrations are going to happen. And you can actually take action based on that, especially around replication, because if you're expecting that those virtual machines can be failed over instantly, and storage DRS has just moved it, and the new data is still being replicated, well, it's not protected anymore. So that could be a huge issue, definitely something to keep in mind. So you need to change your operational procedures around the type of storage that you're running and the way storage DRS is set up.
Great question. So Duncan is telling about I/O load balancing.
He wants you to get a book for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question,
That is a good question.
It even had the storage vendors baffled, so it took them 2 months to figure it out what we're going to do.
Have this one. So to come back, you still can use storage DRS, but for initial placement.
Right.
So create a data store cluster, add your LANs, but disable I/O load balancing. So you still have the benefit of initial placement. So it won't move around for latency, basically. Cool.
Okay, so he basically sort of stole my question.
Moving on.
No, to some degree, we're moving over to SRM for DR, and along those same lines, we're being told by the storage vendors that we should probably only use storage DRS just for the initial placement because it could break SRM. Could you validate that for us?
To my knowledge,
I can validate it for you. Yeah, it won't break Site Recovery Manager.
Well, at least the
it will break your
piece.
operational procedures. It will break your recovery plans. Because, at some point you might be unprotected. When the storage vMotion happens, and it's a large virtual machine, it's, let's say, 200 gigabyte, it's going to take a while before it's protected again. So that's something you need to keep in mind. You can still use storage DRS. You can use the IO metric even. You can use the space balancing, but only you can use it for initial placement, and you can use it for balancing as well. But as soon as you've done the balancing, make sure that the replication happens. So do that during off hours. Make sure that your organization is actually aware that machines are moving around. You're using storage DRS to avoid issues as well. Storage DRS it's not only about load balancing, but it's about avoiding downtime, for instance, based on space, but even performance SLAs can be impacted. So that's why you should be using storage DRS, but it has an impact, definitely.
So there's about 10 minutes left. I know some people are going to start to get up to go to other sessions, but I do want to get to the last three folks that have questions, so we'll crank through these last three.
Yeah.
Okay. Earlier, someone was talking about how they created their VMs for SQL Server databases where they would do a separate OS, database, LUN, VMDKs, and they put those on separate data stores. So this seems to kind of line up, at least with something, Duncan, you had on your blog a while back where somebody was asking, should you do separation like you did in the physical world? And I think part of your answer included, I'm not sure if you used this term, but you said, if you have everything on the same data store, then they're all sharing like the same channels. So separating them would theoretically reduce the contention. So kind of with that in mind, and then now thinking of storage DRS, I'm kind of wondering, well, does storage DRS operate at the VM level, or does it operate at the VMDK level? Because there's a difference. Obviously, if a VM has multiple VMDKs, it could theoretically just storage DRS one of those VMDKs. And then similarly, how does it actually make the decision? If there are a lot of VMDKs and or VMs, whichever metric it uses, it's going to say, okay, I'm crossed over the 15 millisecond response time. How does it say which VM it's going to move? Does it look at each VM's piece of the pie of that latency, and then does it actually expose it to us? So I guess that was two questions. Sorry.
So it will basically want to do a quick win. So with the least amount of effort and the least amount of impact on performance. If you talk about moving virtual machines away from your data store. So, for instance, if it also depends on the affinity rules of the virtual machine itself. If you use the default, and that's where all virtual machine files need to be in one data store, in one directory, it will move an entire virtual machine away. So if you have a really large virtual machine, it will have some cost associated with it. So it can actually move a couple away to get the latency down instead of moving one big virtual machine away to get the latency down. So it's a really complicated algorithm, of course. I cannot do it in 10 seconds, and he's rushing me.
No, I'm not rushing. I want to touch on the core of the question, which was if the VMDKs are separate on data stores, the storage DRS, if Affinity is disabled, will it move an individual VMDK?
Yes.
Okay. I asked him the same question. I covered my mic, but
thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. We're using 4.1, and we have 3 2-node HADRS clusters, and they all see the same storage. Why is this a better design decision than one 6-node cluster?
It's not.
Thank you.
No, it's not.
It's not. Okay. Hopefully last question. Huh?
Okay. I feel the pain of the Unix guy over there because I'm working for a partner, and we also have like a lot of Unix consultants, and they always come to me and they say, well, your VMware environment, it's super, it's everything and the HA and everything, but you can't do LVM mirroring. And what I was wondering, the new vMotion algorithm is doing this kind of RAID 1 mirror while doing the storage vMotion, right? Why can't you make a new feature that you could do this constantly, like have a RAID 1 constantly over your disk, so that if one storage area would fail, that you would actually have some kind of way to...
I don't know if everyone is actually aware of that new feature that's in storage vMotion. So Storage vMotion uses a new thing which is called the mirror mode driver. And the mirror mode driver basically replaces change block tracking. And what it does when a Storage vMotion is initiated, it actually starts mirroring I/O from blocks which are already copied to the source and destination. And that's basically a sync mirror. And it's a very good question. And I actually asked the same question to the engineers. And it's difficult for me to comment on that because it's all still under NDA. It's definitely something that we will be looking into for the future. So, it's technologies like these that will enable, for instance, to run FT across multiple clusters, across multiple storage devices in the end. I guess some of the storage vendors won't be happy about it because we're basically, going into their space, but that's definitely what's going to happen.
So I'm hoping that it will come out soon and waiting for it.
Thanks.
So there's about 5 minutes left. We just got the 5-minute signal. Is there any last questions for these guys?
One front.
What's that? Oh, up front.
Looking a couple years ahead, with the higher compression ratios that we might be getting on a particular host with more memory, if you're looking at a host with a terabyte of memory, greater CPU cores, and things like that, is there a point where the size of the cluster will start to shrink instead of saying, in our best interest, instead of having 8 to 10 to 12 hosts in a cluster, is it going to get to the point where we might want to start considering to shrink those clusters, the number of hosts?
So just to repeat the question real quick, gentleman up front was asking, as hosts get larger, more memory, more CPU, do we see, or do you guys see clusters going smaller instead of larger?
Yeah, that's what we expected to happen as well. And basically the thing that you're seeing is that the hosts will grow larger, but the virtual machines will start demanding more as well, and the applications will start demanding more as well. If you look at Windows 2008 and the amount of memory that it takes up compared to Windows 2003, it's 2.5 times as much. So I don't think that's going to change. The thing, though, that might change in the future is that you will be able to create larger clusters. And it's going to be a design decision for you and your company. Are you going to do 256 gigs hosts, or will there be 1 terabyte hosts? That's going to be dependent on the amount of hosts that you will need, the amount of memory that you will need, the amount of virtual machines that you'll be running.
Thanks.
We probably have time for one more, so randomly over here.
All right, I win. I just wanted to circle back to what we were talking about before about resource pools when we were doing the Q&A and asking if people were manually assigning shares within the resource pools. I'm pretty sure that Duncan has a post on this on his website talking about the resource pools and the problems associated with getting too many VMs in one specific resource pool, problems with share values and that kind of thing when you get contention. And I've been dealing with this in my environment as well, where the top level gets the most important VMs, then there's a bottom level nobody cares about, and then the middle level, just everything's in there. Yeah. And during contention, I run into a lot of issues with that.
Yeah, so...
What chapter
Nice question for the last one.
Do you already have the book?
What's that?
Do you already have a copy?
Is it the new book or the old
Yeah,
book?
the new one.
I don't have the new one.
Just take the book. It'll be quicker. I'm not kidding. They're going to throw it out in another 2 minutes. So.
I have a session, resource management. It's on... Do
you know what chapter it is?
12 or 13. So I have 2 sessions about this, so maybe check it out. It's resource management deep dive.
Yeah. The main thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing shares, when you're doing your resource pools, when you're setting priorities, make sure that you actually set these priorities based on the amount of virtual machines that are running in that particular resource pools. And there needs to be a relationship between the amount of virtual machines and the priority that you want to give those virtual machines. If you're not doing that correctly, then your low priority virtual machines probably end up with more resources than the high priority virtual machines. And we've seen that out in the field many, many times before. So take that into account when you're actually designing resource pools. Actually, yes. Yeah, there are multiple PowerShell scripts out there that actually automatically create adjust share levels. And I think Eric Slouf actually created a tool as well that actually does the share levels based on the amount of virtual machines in those particular in those particular resource pools.
And remember the resource pooling stuff if you're coming to mine and Dave Hill's VCD, vCloud Director Deep Dive, because we do a lot of stuff with resource pools in there.
It's all resource pools.
It's all resource pools. So I think we'll wrap it up. We got about 1 minute left. So I want to thank everybody for showing up first thing in the morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to Duncan and Frank.